Welcome, everyone. As you're starting to patch in, you are here at the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance Evening Tea with Dean Amir Pasic. We'll be starting as soon as we get a critical mass. It'll just take a moment or two, so bear with us. We had over 183 people signed up, so I'm hoping we'll get a number close to that as everyone starts patching in. And so everyone knows this session is being recorded, so we will save it on our YouTube channel, and we will send it out as we usually do after the program within a couple of days with a nice list of resources, including links to anything we may discuss here and as we may pick up in the chat, or if people suggest is worthy of reading and adding to our resources list. And then we often save it to our website as well on our resources page, so you can access that later. Okay, we are at the hour, so I wanted to officially welcome everyone to the YANA Evening Tea. This evening we're talking about philanthropy with Dean Amir Pasic, class of '85 from Yale, and the, let me get a full title correct, the Eugene R. Tempel Dean and Professor of Philanthropic Studies at Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Welcome, Dean Pasic. Thank you very much for joining us. I thought we could just start right in, and if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the School of Philanthropy and how you came to be there.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such a wonderful group of folks dedicated to the nonprofit sector, and it's wonderful to be back at Yale, albeit virtually. When I came to Yale, I was an international student and had very little idea that so much of our educational and cultural infrastructure was built to a large degree with something called philanthropy, people giving of themselves either through volunteer work or through financial donations. So it took me a while to get to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. I began training as an academic in political science and had a variety of positions there, and also ended up doing some fundraising for some private universities, including Johns Hopkins University, where I did also some strategic planning work. And then I because I had both this academic background and this practical background in philanthropy, these folks who had started the world's first School of Philanthropy came and talked to me, and I thought this was a wonderfully interesting and intriguing experiment in higher education that sought to bring different fields together, but also stay really relevant to people who were practitioners in the broad world of philanthropy. So I've been at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy for 6 years now, and it's been quite an adventure for me as an international person who was mostly hugging private universities on the East Coast to go to a public university in our heartland and this time of our history. But the school itself has been around for 30 years. We began as a center that did some pioneering research work and training work. It was one of the first places you could train to become a fundraiser, and it was one of the first places that tried to generate systematic data about the philanthropic sector, how much people give and where that giving goes. I think we'll look at some slides later on to talk about our flagship research product called Giving USA that comes out every June that measures where philanthropy comes from and where it goes in the United States. But we also have about 20 faculty from different disciplines who are united by this puzzle of generosity, because usually we think about human civilization being built by technology or commerce or the growth of the rule of law, and lost in there somewhere gets what we lose in there somewhere is the notion that a lot of what we've built together has come from voluntary action, kind of the collective global barn raising, if you will, of our activity. And so that's kind of the instinct that unites our faculty and kind of the research that they do, whether it's social psychologists, economists, people who study the history of philanthropy, and they're coming together to explore these issues with the sense that people who have a broader understanding and the context of generosity, both contemporary and historically, will be much better at managing change and driving innovation in the philanthropic sector. So we have bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. We also have institutes that do specific research on particular topics, like an institute on women's philanthropy that looks at gender differences in giving. We have an institute on faith and giving, which a plurality of giving goes to faith. So we study the intersection between faith and giving. And our newest institute is on diversity and philanthropy, looking at donors from diverse backgrounds and trying to create more diverse pipelines to come into philanthropy. So we have these multiplicity of fields looking at generosity and have all these mechanisms for trying to connect to practitioners both domestically and around the world. And I should mention that we were the first entity of its kind. We have a kind of a liberal arts approach to the whole issue because, and I'll end with this, is because there's a lot of academic work and a lot of academic energy behind looking at issues of social good and social impact. The majority of them either come from schools of public policy or from business schools. And the difference is that, in business schools, the serious business is business itself. And then and this is changing because so much is changing. And then if you have extra time, you can get to the secondary effects, which is the social impact and the giving kind of behavior. And it's similar to schools of public administration and public policy, where it really is government policy that is the major lens. And then if you can get to it, or you can outsource some of that work, that goes to the nonprofit sector. What's kind of unique about our school is it begins with the notion of volunteerism and philanthropy as the first lens that we look at, through which we look at the world. So that gives you a little bit of a sketch of our school. We're relatively small, 20 faculty, 250 students. But we do have a nice kind of reputation, both nationally and internationally, and people often come to us when they want to build programs related to philanthropy.
And there are a few others. I mean, do you get to hang out with the other deans of philanthropy schools? Or is it still kind of interdisciplinary? I don't know. It's a relatively new field, as you're saying, to have a school.
There are other centers of excellence. Some of the places that offer degrees are usually in schools of public policy or public administration, and we hang out with folks like that, or people who do social impact kind of work in business schools. But there are also some important centers that necessarily don't offer degrees. So at Duke, at Grand Valley State, the Johnson Center in Michigan, the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford, and there are increasingly a number of these centers. There's one at the London School of Economics that has just been created, and another one at Oxford. So there's more and more centers where people want to do convening and research, but they're kind of combining the research and the convening with the academic degrees is something that we're pretty rare at. There's another school of philanthropy in China that is being created, and so it's kind of catching on.
Oh, interesting. So I want to ask you some questions about the difference between what we understand as American philanthropy and how charitable giving works around the world. And I know we don't have as much government support for a lot of these fields, which is why I gather private sector has jumped in. But just curious, I want to get a little bit into the sort of academic aspect of what
Sure.
You and your colleagues do at the school. So, into this idea, what is philanthropy? And sort of, we've got a group of very smart, intelligent people on the line. We like to dig deep and think about these kind of Eric concepts. What is volunteer? What have they found in the research about what is volunteerism? What is philanthropy? And how does it kind of operate in our country?
Oh, sure. So, we have an expansive definition of philanthropy. Usually when you watch read about philanthropy in the press, they talk either about the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, or Jeff Bezos or Musk, or they think about large concentrations of wealth. We define kind of as a working definition. Academics rarely agree on things perfectly in terms of definitional issues, but it's kind of voluntary action for the public good. So kind of private action for the public good, but voluntary action for the public good. And what that means is that everybody is a philanthropist. Everybody has an urge, whether it's kind of strategically thought out or not, to give, to be generous. And there's research that social psychologists do about 2-year-old toddlers who, if they see somebody dropping something, they will immediately, without being socialized to do so, kind of have an instinct to help them out. So, what our faculty look at is, the role of, we have social psychologists to give you a flavor of the research, the range of it. We have economists who count, how much people do give, how much money is actually separated from people, and what are the different demographics that we see more or less of it, and how this changes over time. We also have people who are social psychologists who look at the health benefits of giving. So the fact that the people who donate and volunteer tend to have better health outcomes. We have social psychologists also who look at the role of gratitude. Several historians who look at the importance of voluntary action in building the movements that have led to social change as well. So that gives you a flavor. We're very proud of one of our junior faculty who just came out with a book called The Gospel of Giving, about the kind of an academic biography of Madame C.J. Walker, who was the first self-made woman millionaire in the United States. She was a Black woman who sold beauty products and had a whole social enterprise around them during the Jim Crow era as well. And he uses her story as a way to dispel the myth that that people of color and Black people are generally the recipients of philanthropy. And he recovers and makes us aware of the rich history of Black philanthropy, even in kind of situations of Jim Crow and oppression, that helps sustain those communities, not only those communities, but helps sustain some of the values and principles of freedom and the values that we had espoused at the founding of our republic. So there's kind of a different set. So to give you a sense of the coherence of the curriculum, so the undergraduates, it's really a liberal arts degree based on a pathway that you look at generosity, and one of the mechanisms that students use is to generate it's wonderful to see people putting references in the chats to that. That's great.
That's Leanna Epstein. She helps us with Deanna. So thank you, Leanna, for pulling those up. I figured you would.
Sorry. That's great. So where was I? I'm sorry.
One of your faculty, or the curriculum. Sorry, starting.
The curriculum. Yeah. So our undergraduates develop a philanthropic autobiography at the beginning of their major, and then they reflect on that when they graduate in a capstone exercise. The master's program is more intended for people who already had several years in the field and have some context and know what they're getting into. So you study the ethics, comparative civil society, fundraising, grant making, and then you have some electives too that you can put in there as well. So it's really a combination of different disciplines coming together to try to illuminate this field and help practitioners succeed. And we have had kind of interesting alumni who have gone on to do kind of adventurous things. It's not a degree that you can pull off the shelf that is easily branded like an MBA or an MPA. So it kind of attracts people who are a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more driven by curiosity than the security of a kind of definite certificate. And they end up going and doing kind of interesting, usually adventurous work in the process.
Oh, sorry. If something's being, just people ask a question, you should feel free to ask questions in the Q&A or the chat function. Leanna Epstein, who you may recognize her name from all of our communications from Yana, is also posting some programs. Oh, it says to all panelists. We'll try, and maybe we can do that because your chat is only going to panelists, which just means me and Dean Pasic, so maybe we can try to do it. If you don't see it during the chat, we will definitely, chat may not work for some reason while we're in webinar format, but don't worry, we will definitely collect all these and send it out in the future. And feel free to ask questions as well when we're there. Oh, somebody asked a question I was going to ask about a certificate programs in philanthropy. I was going to ask Dean Pasic whether, I know you have I participated in some terrific webinars and sort of programs you've done. What about certificate programs or executive education?
Yeah, so we began as an executive education program over 40 years ago. And that's called, confusingly enough, because we're a school, and within a school we have a professional development program called the Fundraising School, which is in 20 cities around the country that offers certificates in fundraising management. And most recently, we're also developing a certificate in digital fundraising as well. So these are short 2-3 day programs, usually in person, but now we have moved them online, slowly opening up a few cities. We've opened up Indianapolis about 6 months ago. But those have been wonderful practitioner. What we take is some of the research that our faculty does and the research that's emerging throughout the field, which is growing, and translate that into practitioner accessible insights. So usually have a researcher and a practitioner offering those in person. And if you just go to the professional development tab of our website, you can see our offerings right there.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We also have certificates in the academic program, which is kind of, when you think about certificates, they're a little like micro masters. So you can get a certificate and you can take it at your own pace, and then when you're ready, you can kind of keep going and get your master's program, a master's degree.
Got it, got it. Okay, I want to shift a little bit to, well, getting back to talking about this unique world of American philanthropy. You describe yourself as an international person coming to the US, and now you're something. What is different about the way charitable giving, philanthropy in the US versus, comparatively, if there's been research or your understanding of how it operates elsewhere in the world?
Yes, so there's a broader conversation about American exceptionalism across various domains of social life. But I think what is unique about American giving is that it is quite extensive and quite generous. I think we should preface that by saying generosity is part of human life and human communities everywhere around the world. So you don't want to say that Americans are generous and big-hearted, and people in different parts of the world are stingy and not as open-hearted. But we have also the advantage that we have a great system of counting through our tax returns, especially the 990s, as you all in the nonprofit sector. We have a great a way of counting that few other countries do. So when you compare countable generosity in terms of money going out and compare that to GDP levels, the fact that we have giving that's monetary giving that's 2% of GDP. The closest country that comes to that is the UK, which is about 0.75 GDP, and then New Zealand and Australia. And then other countries are, in terms of that monetary giving, are even smaller proportions of that as well. There's another measure that's really interesting that is done by Gallup worldwide in collaboration with the Charities Aid Foundation. And what they do is every couple of years they go in and interview thousands of people around the world and ask them if they have helped somebody, given some money to somebody over the last month in their lives. And there, United States doesn't come up on top. It's, believe it or not, Myanmar typically comes up on top, and people mostly think that's something to do with the Buddhist tradition and helping monks as part of their habits as well. But I think there's also kind of a philosophical American appreciation of philanthropy and associational life that harkens back to Tocqueville, and the sense that both his observation and often our sense of what our public life is composed of is this very intense associational life. We often associate not only to appeal to the government, but also to help ourselves and to help our fellow citizens. And that's not an uncontested legacy, because some people have used the Tocquevillian associational intensity to say, we don't need as much work from the government. And anytime you involve the government in trying to decide what the appropriate size of it is, size and its character in our country, you get into contested territory. But I think that's kind of the measurable size of American philanthropy is larger than anywhere else, with the caveat that most other countries don't measure as well as we do. But also this self-conception of ourselves as being, deeply civically engaged, the front porch sense of which some people are trying to get back to, kind of reweave our social fabric that is under such stress under these polarized circumstances. Kind of a self-conception we used to have, at least, that was strong, that we are civically engaged with each other in ways that are not necessarily always appealing to the formal political structures.
Fascinating, thank you. And I'm sure we could do all sorts of studies and learn more about those very concepts and what's underlying, as you said, in Myanmar. Perhaps it's the Buddhist, perhaps, these sort of sociological and historical underpinnings of the types and self-identifications of philanthropic giving. I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the findings that your school has found and research, and talk about some of the trends, because a lot of our, we often get questions from people going like, how do we do foundation grants? And I'm like, I think it's pretty tough, and I think it's pretty small. And I just, as you mentioned, the plurality of donations go to faith-based institutions. But let's start with the donors first. Who are they? Do we know much about like what the types of donors there are, by how much in our country, and has that changed over the past couple of decades? And I would say maybe even just during the last year or two. What kind of research?
Sure. Well, what hasn't changed over the last year, which is fascinating in and of
No.
itself. But no, this might be a time to put up the slide, Rachel, just
Sure.
from the Giving USA, because that gives you a nice graphic of where the money comes from and where the money is going.
Yep. Let me just share this.
I know that boards and bosses often focus on foundations because they're so prominent and they're in the business of giving away money.
All right. Can you see that now?
Yeah, I think we can see that. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think people are often told about let's go to the foundations because they're the ones whose business it is actually to give away money. So it's interesting to see that foundations are less than 20% of giving. So this is a picture of 2019 contributions. So this is pre-pandemic. This research came out last June, and so this gives us a sense of where we had come in American giving right before the pandemic hit us. So you see, it's almost 450 billion, and individuals account for 70%. But if you think about the fact that bequests are also come from individuals, and that there are some foundations that are family foundations, really more driven by families, you see, 3/4 of giving in the United States is driven primarily by individuals. So let me also tell you one of the trends that we have seen also in some of the research that we have done is the number of households giving in the United States has actually been going down over the last 10 years. We used to be able to say, 10, 15 years ago that more Americans gave than voted in elections. And I'm not sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. It was just kind of a pattern that was a higher frequency habit for Americans was giving rather than voting. Now, obviously, with the last several elections, voting participation has gone up significantly. At the same time, about 10 million households are not giving as they used to in the past. And that's not dissimilar to the other kinds of concentrations that we're seeing in many fields of life and in industries. And wealth, the inequality also in giving. We're seeing most nonprofits also report anecdotally that they are raising, more, maybe slightly more money, but the money is coming from a smaller number of donors, wealthier donors at the same time. Over time, also, yeah. So I think
I was going to say, is there the Bernie Sanders phenomenon where there were like a lot of millennials giving $5, and was there more of that, or was that just sort of a one-time event, and now we're kind of back to fewer donors giving more?
Well, that's one of the questions about the way we're doing research right now. It's primarily a good bit of it, and it's supplemented by surveys, especially in the congregational area with faith, and also in terms of surveying crowdfunding sites, because online giving is growing extremely rapidly, and of course has exploded during the pandemic, but it's still growing from a relatively small base. But there may be some crowdfunding that we're not capturing because it might not necessarily be going through the tax forms. It might not be the equivalent of a check to a 501c3. It could be a GoFundMe campaign or a Facebook campaign where you are just directly giving money to an individual, which won't get matched. Now, are you giving the money to the individual because they're in need and it's a philanthropic act, or are you just being kind of flippant and sending somebody $50 to go take a fun vacation in Hawaii? How do you count those things? So there's a lot of things happening online in the digital space that people who understand the millennial and earlier generations are telling us that the habits of civic engagement are changing, and that you can't really use the equivalent of the check to a 501c3 anymore to measure people's philanthropic engagement anymore. There's a lot of activism going on, a lot of digital activism that we need to measure in different ways. So we're looking at that, but for now, these are the kinds of things we're looking at the money flow, and this at least gives you a rough picture of how things are going.
Sure. I'm going to go to the next slide.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, you'll see kind of the counterpart of this slide. You'll see kind of where the money is going. As I mentioned, religion is on top there, and that's where you see a lot of everyday givers, everyday American givers. You don't see that many corporations or foundations involved in everyday giving. And as the affiliation with official religions is going down, so the kind of the folks who say that they are they're
Nuns.
not nuns, the nuns, they're,
Nuns, I think people call them, yeah.
the nuns are they're not affiliated with any congregation. Their giving is actually formally going down, and we see also that religious affiliation doesn't only matter for religious giving. Religious people in general give more to non-religious issues as well. So if you're worried about the overall landscape of giving, the fact that religious affiliation is going down is something to watch and be worried about. So 25 years ago, religion would have been 50% of all giving in the United States. It is kind of it has been in a secular decline. And 25, 30 years ago, environment and international affairs would have been too small to count. So those are some of the changes. I'll also mention, since we're at this slide, that what we have typically seen in recessions and crises is that giving to social service organizations goes up, and I think we'll see that again when we measure exactly what happened during the pandemic. And what tends to suffer are arts organizations. They tend to go down. Although we've seen some interesting kind of heroic donors coming through and continuing their giving or supporting actors and performers, even though they couldn't go out and perform and act, just to keep the organization going. But those are some of the patterns that we've seen in previous recessions and crises. The social services go up, and then the arts tend to be affected.
Yeah. Now, on the bottom, the 12% gifts to grant-making foundations, are those things like donor-advised funds or community funds?
No, those are actually donations to create foundations, and so we make sure that we track that, so that kind of a donation to create a foundation, and then we don't double count the money that comes out of that foundation later on. So.
And where would donor-advised funds go? I mean,
they would be under public society benefit. So public society benefit.
Okay.
It includes think tanks, United Jewish Appeals. That would also include donor-advised funds as well.
Even like the regular Fidelity or charitable.
Yes, so that would include
funds.
that would include the commercial donor-advised funds. Community foundations also have donor-advised funds, and that would go to grant-making foundations. So that would be counted under the gifts to grant-making foundation separately, even though the legal vehicle is pretty much the same between a community foundation and a Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard donor-advised fund.
Right. We're doing a whole separate program on those types of things and what the differences are and how you set one up or how that kind of works. So, well, this is fascinating to see this, and I'm sure it's going to be even more interesting to see. When do you expect the 2020 data to come out? I'm sure you've got people.
June. It's usually the middle of June is when it comes out. So our team is busy running around, and it's a large collaborative effort. We collaborate with Candid, used to be known as Foundation Center. The CECP provides the corporate data, and then we have some surveys that we've done of congregations, and then they model all of this together, and it gets kind of released in June, and then every year we also do slightly kind of an update as more data come in, because it's kind of a projection even when it comes out in June. But we sometimes call it the GDP of giving, because it's kind of the foundational piece and kind of the most rigorous data we have in terms of what's going on in the world of philanthropy, which is not much. I mean, compared to, think about how much data we get from the government and from the private sector in terms of what's going on all the time. Enough to fill several cable news networks. What's going on in the world of generosity. There's a lot going on there, but we don't measure it, and we don't count it the way the other sectors do.
Yeah, well, we'd love to give it some more. And that's why we're doing these, is to give it more of a positive platform. So do any of these questions ever come in, like a census or any kind of longitudinal studies? I know there's a lot of studies like for education and things like that. Have there been any sort of similar nationwide longitudinal studies with respect to charitable giving?
Yeah, so we do something called the Philanthropy Panel Study. We do it in collaboration with the Institute for Social Studies at University of Michigan. It's an NSF-funded study of 10,000 American households that's done every 2 years. And it's called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And for the last 20 or so years, we've been adding questions about giving and volunteering to this this instrument. It leads to all kinds of insights. The first one, the one I mentioned, that the number of households who are actually giving on a regular basis is going down. And that's leading a lot of people to worry about what that means for our democracy. But it's also leading to insights about kind of intergenerational dynamics. What kind of behaviors or talking of parents and grandparents correlate with giving to what kinds of causes by their grandparents. I'm sorry, by their grandkids. So you can see some of those intergenerational dynamics. You can also see some of the gender differences over time. And so that philanthropy panel study feeds into a lot of the research that our Women's Philanthropy Institute does on differences in gender giving, for example. And those kinds of, depending on whether your household is a single family household or both a dual earning couple, or you can also look at different demographics in terms of donors of color, LGBTQ donors. So we've looked at all of those things based on that philanthropy panel study that is done every couple of years. And that's a very powerful piece of research.
Someone asked a question, this probably relates to what you mentioned before, whether platforms like GoFundMe or even like, I know there are a whole bunch out there, do they count as philanthropy, or is that, I guess they're not going to establish 501c3s, but does that get caught, or is that what you're working on now, is trying to figure out how to capture that kind of information?
Well, Blackbaud, which is a database that a lot of nonprofits use, surveys their client base, which is relatively large, and they keep track of kind of how much is being raised kind of by digital means. But that's a little bit different than what happens with GoFundMe. We're doing a piece of research with Facebook to look at some of the campaigns that people do on Facebook to see kind of what are some of the patterns that are done there. But I think it's fascinating because GoFundMe has been kind of exploding in use during the pandemic, and the CEO, as many of you may know, of GoFundMe has come out and said that one of the things they never wanted their platform to be used for is as a kind of as a safety net for Americans who are in dire straits, and they go on GoFundMe and say, I'm losing my job, I'm losing my house, I can't pay for my health care, please help me. And so that kind of explosion of the online platforms is sometimes that's the extreme of it. The other extreme of it is people also, as I said before, will raise funds for things that are clearly not philanthropic, like to take a vacation, or there will be a Kickstarter campaign to create some kind of a quasi product or an experience. So it's very difficult, and we had it relatively easy when you would see when things hit the 990 form, and you could hit it there. So we have to, I think, we're trying to figure out ways of collaborating with these online platforms to figure out, as our civic lives migrate more and more onto these digital platforms, how can we get insight into what's going on there? And of course, we know that social movements, when you think about the broad expanse of philanthropy, they're being organized on social media that are essentially private companies. So I think that those are very difficult issues. So if your audience is interested in that, and I don't know that you've had her before, but Lucy Brunholtz, who's I think my year at Yale, she runs the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford, and she is one of the leaders in kind of critiquing the power of the commercial platforms, but also thinking about what it would mean to have a civic alternative. And there are some people who are looking at nonprofit alternatives, albeit very small, to some of these facilities and these tools that most of us use on a daily basis without thinking twice.
Well, good. Well, I'll drop your name when we reach out to her to see if she'll do a program.
Oh, I'm sure she will. I'm sure she will.
No, thank you for that reference. We always love to hear about other Yaleys who'd like to spotlight. I have a follow-up question for you about donor-advised funds and also foundations about, are there or should there be limits about how long these funds can hold on to the corpus of the trust or whatever it is, including foundations? Is there pressure, or are they getting changes to be able to spend down more to address some of the issues we've seen, like the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and some other pressing needs over the past, couple of years?
Yeah, I think especially with the pandemic and the racial reckoning after the killing of George Floyd, a lot of it looks like from preliminary evidence, a lot of the DAF, these commercial DAFs, the big ones, have succeeded in and their donors to really get more money flowing out. And the research that has been done, and we are part of a consortium that is trying to do research on DApps. It does look like about 20%, depending, and there's different arguments about how you should count these things. About 20% of the funds that go in end up going out in the same year, which is more than the 5% on the foundations, the private foundations, which have to give out 5% overall. But what's interesting is I think all of these things are up for question. I think we're so much more ready to question a lot of things. So, in the late 60s, when the 5% payout requirement was generated, most people thought it would be a kind of a floor, and that many foundations would actually spend a lot more, but it ended up being a ceiling. And it's very rare that you'll find a foundation that'll go above 5% as well. So I think what's interesting about the DApps is, and it's, I think what really bothers people is the anonymity. It allows people to have anonymity, and then there's also some issues in terms of counting closely held gifts and kind of not easily tradable securities, and that's something that it's very difficult for a regular nonprofit to absorb. And then the question is, how are those closely held unusual assets valued, and how much does it benefit kind of tax relief does the donor get, and how much of that actually ends up going to a beneficiary. So I think the problem there is that, that's okay. We can go international too. I think one of the interesting things about DApps is also that it's not only the big commercial DApps, but all of our community foundations, which have been a huge help during the pandemic. Most of them have had relief funds and have kind of used their local knowledge. But our community foundations also have the same legal structure, so that when people start talking about reform, it's not simply the commercial DApps, but it's all of our kind of a wonderful community foundation network that is implicated in those conversations as well. But there's the Madoff-Arnold policy proposal right now to change some of the rules for the donor advised funds. And I'm not a great reader of tea leaves in Congress, but right now it doesn't seem that there's all that much appetite to do much about it. But there's certainly some interesting conversations around the donor advised fund. We did some research just to finish up on the donor advised funds last fall with Schwab. We surveyed nonprofits, and it's amazing how everybody knows that Fidelity now gives out more grants in a year than the Gates Foundation, and the top 10 kind of charities in the U.S. are these commercial DApps. And over the last 15 years, they've become such a big part of the ecosystem. 70% of nonprofits have received a donation from DApps, and many are still confused about how they work. So, regardless of the regulatory questions we might have about, are there a distortion of giving patterns? Many people are still confused about how they work and how they can take advantage of them.
Okay, so those of you who are in the audience are confused, we're going to do a couple of programs, I think, on this, and we may have to bring Dean Pasic back, but we'll certainly get some folks from the different kinds of community foundations and maybe the commercial DApps, so we can get into a little bit.
I can recommend better experts than me on DApps who know a lot more than I do.
Okay, good. We'll find someone. All right, so I think this is the last slide you get me on. We'll get back to it, and then people are asking questions. I do want to get a little bit more about the demographics of donors, and as well as the types of organizations and the efforts now with the sort of the racial reckoning and COVID issues. But let's just, because we have these slides up, and then we can. What did you want to show with this one?
No, I wanted to show people, the flow of philanthropy around the world. So I think we all have an instinctive sense how important it is, that the World Health Organization, relies on the Gates Foundation for a lot of its funding, and how big it is, and how big humanitarian flows are in general. So what this shows you is a picture of private flows across borders compared to official development assistance. So official development assistance are the wealthy countries who give to the developing world, and you see that the overall is 175 billion. It was in 2018, and that compares to private capital investment flows, 109, and then remittances, when people give back to their family members. Let's say they're South Asians working in UAE or Mexicans working in the United States, and they send money back home. So in that landscape, you see that of that overall picture, philanthropy is $68 billion. There's one country where actually philanthropic flows are larger than official development assistance, and that's the United States. So in the US, our philanthropy going abroad is larger than our official development assistance. So everything that goes through the USAID or official aid that we give abroad is much less, and that would have been another slide, but it's something called the Global Philanthropy Tracker that looks at this every year, every couple of years. We have two international studies that are, this is the one that looks at the kind of flows of resources. And there's another one that we do that one came out last year. It's called the Global Philanthropy Environment Index that looks at 80 countries around the world and kind of the ease of doing philanthropic world in those different countries based on expert evaluations. And that looks at culture, political, tax, regulatory issues. And the purpose of that is really to help educate policymakers about the importance of philanthropy, because those of you who are in the field know that the space of civic society has been kind of shrinking in countries, whether in Eastern Europe or India or China, where governments have started to kind of close the space available to nonprofits and free giving because they're worried about challenges to their own authority. So this is supposed to be, not one of these, beauty contests where you rank people for the sake of ranking them, but really to start a conversation among policymakers in terms of where does philanthropy actually fit into the mix of things that we're trying to do to improve social outcome. Excellent. So I thought that would be just an interesting kind of overall kind of landscape view of, how much, where does philanthropy fit into the kind of global flow of resources across borders?
Excellent. And I think that was the last slide you had for us.
Yeah.
So let's stop sharing the screen and let me get back. All right, so we've gotten a lot of questions, but I want to, we're sort of jumping around, but let's talk a bit about the sort of demographics to the extent of the composition of donors. I've had some questions about, is it, what can we tell about who gives? Is it the man on the street? Is it the wealthy families? Is it the average person? And sort of, what percentages are those groups? And then also race, class, if they're foreign born or not. I mean, what other kind of demographic information have people been able to glean from whatever data they've been collecting?
Yeah, so there's different cuts at that. I think some people show that there's kind of a U-shaped curve where relatively people with relatively meager resources tend to give more proportion of their income. I forget the exact proportions. And then, people at the highest level, give a slightly bigger proportion. And then there's a little bit of a trough that happens in the middle. And we have data on kind of the average gifts that people give based on the measures that we do. And I don't really remember off the top of my head, but I think the average gift in the United States is somewhere around $500 annual gift. Mm-hmm. And that's, from the very large to the very, very lowest. In terms of the demographic composition of, how many rich people does it take to make up half of the giving in the United States? And that has been creeping up. So I think, it used to be that we could say that everyday Americans accounted for more than half of giving in the United States, that, the donors under a certain income level, not high net worth donors, would have accounted for the vast majority of giving. You saw the religion piece and some of the education pieces as well. And social service also tends to get a lot of everyday donors, and that's been skewing up. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but we do have those kind of proportions and estimates, and increasingly it's becoming concentrated. John List at the University of Chicago, has done some work on the kind of the role of the very, very wealthy family. So, both kind of the top 1,000 families account for a huge proportion of our tax revenue, but also increasingly for a huge proportion of our philanthropic dollars in a formal way as well. In terms of gender issues, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, before you do that, Evan, has there been, what's underlying that? Is it just, you said there's clearly been the shift. Is it lack of or decreased amount of disposable income? Has it been kind of a cultural shift or something? What's behind some of that? Do you know?
Well, millennials have, for example, much larger student debts, and they have been delaying some of the markers of adulthood that some of our, or normal adulthood that some of our sociologists have marked, things like buying property and starting families. Those things have been delayed in part of it may be cultural, but part of it is also the fact that they had very large student debts, which tends to dampen. And then they've gone through the Great Recession too. So those are some of the reasons that there's that overhang that tracks them. But we do have the data. I just don't recall off the top of my head in terms of
sure we can find
average gift. But I think there's also some interesting gender and kind of race dynamics as well. So our Women's Philanthropy Institute shows that keeping everything equal, women will tend to give more than men. So in general, women will tend to be more generous than men. And then we also find that there's little difference among religious groups, except that actually the Jewish religious group seems to give more, and not only to Jewish causes, but to causes outside of religious traditions as well. One of the interesting findings is also that people will generally report that what do they think that they give, and usually people say, oh, I probably give about 10% of my income, but it's not really. It's really more like 2%. Most people do not give 10%, except for the Mormons, who actually do as a group tend to tithe. So we see those differences as well. We also see no differences with immigrants. People often think about immigrants as being incorrectly, and I'm biased, of course, but immigrants as being a burden on society. But once you control for income, immigrants are just as regular as native-born Americans, and the same is true for African Americans, and that's some of the research that we've been doing as well.
Okay, excellent. Let's talk about the recipients now. Let's go back to the donees. You gave us the sort of chart of the kind of categories of institutions that are the receiving end. What about sort of like the size and maybe who's running them? Can you get a little more granular on what's the traditional type of nonprofit? Is it like the big ones, like the Red Crosses and maybe your church or something, or are there a lot of little ones as well?
Well, it's amazing. We have so many nonprofits, and it's becoming increasingly easier to create them, and they just keep proliferating. And the nonprofit sector is such an important part of our economy. 10% of employment is in the nonprofit sector, so it's a very vibrant part of our economy that many people don't know about as much. But it is, unfortunately, also a question of concentration. So if you look at where the money goes, it's again, if you look at the top 100 largest nonprofits in the United States, they will absorb a disproportionate amount of donations, for example. So I think what was quite interesting was Mackenzie Scott's really interesting and if you will unconventional generosity that was so large and grand. And inspired by, she used a line from Emily Dickinson to justify how she was going to go about it, which I thought was wonderful. And most people, when they first heard about her donations, thought it was spam because they had no previous connection, so they had to contact some of these YMCA's and HBCUs for the first time. But this is a problem that both she and before her Jeff Bezos faced when they first wanted to make donations. It's very difficult to give $10 million or $100 million to your local soup kitchen. They just don't know how to absorb it. And some of the even larger food banks that have received these large gifts are now wondering what to do with those large amounts of money. So there's an absorption capacity among these small, wonderful nonprofits that reflect accessibility for many more Americans. They're not the kind of quasi-corporate structures that we see, and you can think of, Yale itself is a nonprofit, right? And that is very different than the shelter that sits close to Yale. That is also in the same legal category, but a very different kind of capacity to absorb those dollars. So we do see a story of concentration there, but there's a lot of movements by people trying to figure out how to create networks across nonprofits to avoid duplication, to use mechanisms like United Ways or other possibilities to create capacity that could be shared by these smaller nonprofits that do not have the ability to scale up and to be known to more people.
You know, I didn't ask this question. Another kind of entity is the sort of fiscal sponsor. Is that tracked? Because the fiscal sponsors may be, you know, supporting all kinds of nonprofits that are acting without otherwise IRS, you know, official determination. But is there any way to track to see, like, is it just, do you just be able to measure the sponsor itself, or do you get through that and see how many other institutions they're supporting?
I think that's a great question. That's a great question. Anecdotally, knowing some of these fiscal sponsors, like you know, one of the founders of Arabella is on our board, and he tells me that, you know, the fiscal sponsor business is booming. You know, especially as you know, high net worth individuals or ultra high net worth individuals are increasingly looking for alternatives to creating their own foundation. Many of them have, you know, there are billion-dollar accounts at some of these commercial DAFs. They use those, but they also want to be more programmatically involved, and that's where they, you know, say, you know, I'm interested in XYZ program, and they go to a fiscal sponsor and they say, you know, can you help make this program happen? I don't want to create my own infrastructure, and that business is growing very rapidly. We don't have reliable counts on that, but kind of all the anecdotal evidence tells us that it's getting quite large.
Well, I'm interested to learn more about. I mean, no, I think you're right. We've seen a lot of pop-up nonprofits, particularly during COVID and such, and they don't have time, or they're not interested in doing this for long haul and trying to help connect them with everything from sort of official kind of, I would say, commercial sponsors to sort of somebody they're aligned with who might be willing to take them underneath their wing. So it'll be interesting to see how that developed over 2020 and recently. If we could also talk a little bit more about we just talked about the types of nonprofits or the concentration of where the money's going. What about the causes to which, or the programs or the types? I mean, you know, we get a lot of discussion on our end that people say, well, no one's going to want to donate to general operations or to staff, even though that may be 90% of your operating costs. Right. How much, can you tell how much are sort of, you know, restricted funds that are going to support specific programs or fellowships, and how much is just going to sort of administrative general operations, you know, for the nonprofits themselves?
So I think we're seeing a sea change, you know, and you know, it's like many things happen through the pandemic. We have to see, you know, how much of that is going to be reversed. But you know, the foundation pledge saying that, you know, they're going to relax measurements and reporting requirements on their grantees. The rise of this notion of trust-based philanthropy that is trying to get away from the kind of impact evaluation, strict measurement, accountability, which in some quarters is seen as a way of displacing diversity and inclusiveness, because you're kind of asking people to conform to a model where the donor gets to kind of dictate and have all the power. But you know, if you're a philanthropist, what you're trying to do is engage the community and get the community to help direct the benefits that it's going to receive. So democratizing philanthropy, bringing the community members who are supposed to benefit into the decision-making process, creating more trust, less evaluation, kind of accountability. I'm going to surveil exactly what you do because ultimately I don't trust you and I want to keep control. I think there's a mind shift there that those kind of patterns are, you know, probably self-defeating, and that and people are talking about trust-based philanthropy, democratizing philanthropy, being, you know, to be crude, to be looser with their funding and just trust people that they're going to do good work with what they're doing. And that's in part, I think, a response to the crisis and the fact that people were in deep need, and there wasn't, you know, given the fact that you have to go save people and figure out how to help each other, there's no time to kind of fill out spreadsheets and come up with theories of change and make sure you're reporting according to whatever template the smartest people you hired told you that you need to tell your grantees to follow. So I think that, and that's part of, you know, not disconnected from the racial reckoning and the sense that, you know, Black-led and organizations run by people of color need to be prioritized, and many organizations are doing that as well. So I think those are changes that I think, just because we've also seen some changes in leadership, are likely to stick, at least for some portions of the sector as we go forward. And we'll see how deeply these changes survive after the pandemic. But I do think we've seen a sea change and a kind of a change in attitude in terms of the usual sense that you know, in order to spend your money well, you have to control the people who are receiving it, to put it kind of crudely, right?
Mm-hmm. We might have some disagreements or some discussions from various foundations.
I'm not saying that's my view. I'm just saying I think that's the trend that we're seeing that is pretty widespread.
Okay. I know we're getting close to the hour and we've got a lot of questions. I did want to want to ask one sort of last question about the kind of players in this space and about the fundraising professionals. What information do we have about that? I know if you look at, my understanding is that it's heavily white. And that is, and I don't know if your school is producing people who go in to do professional fundraising. It sounds like they do a variety of things. What's going on with the diversity in sort of the fundraising profession, to the extent you know?
Well, that's a great question. The fundraising profession, 30 some years ago used to be white male dominated. Now it's a white female dominated, and there is an issue of bringing more people of color into the profession. And I think that's increasingly recognized as an issue. Our school, about half of our students do go into fundraising. The other half go into program officer work or other programmatic elements of the nonprofit sector, or even the public or the private sector. But what we're doing in our small school is we're also creating an environment that is conducive to attracting people of color and helping them stay through the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy, that is doing research on communities of color, because people are also realizing that not all donors are white and male. We started seeing that with the Women's Philanthropy Institute, the important role of women as leaders in philanthropy, the role of women in creating giving circles. Giving circles are also a very important phenomenon that has accelerated recently, and there's a huge overrepresentation of women in those kind of socially intense ways of deciding how to give away. How to give away money. But the Mays Family Institute is doing this research and foregrounding the experiences of people of color in philanthropy. And so I think that's very important as you're kind of recruiting African Americans and other people of color into the profession, to find a place that also recognizes their experience as being part of philanthropy, and that they're simply not there to go solicit old white males. That there is a cultural space for them there as well. And many of the professional associations are now foregrounding the issues of inclusiveness, belonging, and diversity, realizing that is it's first of all a mismatch. It's not representative of what these institutions that we fundraise for want to be about, and it doesn't reflect the demographics of wealth. I mean, just in terms of the bottom line, that's the demographics of wealth is female and increasingly not white. So I think those are the issues that the fundraising profession is increasingly paying attention to this.
Excellent. Thank you for touching on that. I'm seeing a lot of questions about how the changes in tax policy by the U.S. might affect giving in any given year.
Well, we had one of the things that happened today was the S&P closed at a record high, and the one correlate in terms of that predicts giving in the United States on a macro level is the state of the stock market. That's kind of one of the correlates, and there's the tax policy. I think makes a difference on the margin. Where the biggest tax policy change that we have experts who study this has been the TCJA, the tax policy change under the Trump administration, and primarily because it decreased the number of people who itemize deductions, and so more people take the standard deduction. So the price of giving for a lot of those people has gone up in kind of economics speak. And so the people who look at Giving USA say that were it not, and the economists differ on this, but were it not for that increase in the price of giving, we would have actually reached a true record last year. We didn't. We reached a nominal record. It was still kind of flat if you take account for inflation. That the giving would have been higher, except for that tax issue. But the tax, the charitable tax deduction, takes a huge amount of effort. Not effort, but a lot of attention, because on the margin it makes a big difference, and it is the one place where the government has an explicit mandate or an explicit habit of regulating the nonprofit sector. It's through the tax vehicle.
Okay, good. All right, so two sort of larger questions. One was sort of the trend or maybe an ideal of collaboration among nonprofits. You mentioned some of these alliances or something that may look to sort of not cross paths or to duplicate efforts. Is there more of a push out there, either by donors or by nonprofits themselves, saying we can, we're all sort of mission driven, doing the same? I mean, they're all working on food insecurity or something. Are you seeing any trends along those lines of alliances and collaborations?
I think there's a lot of efforts. For a while, collective impact was a buzzword, and generated by Bridgespan very smartly. And the fact that to attack some of these problems, perennial social problems, that you need actors from different fields, private, public, nonprofit, and multiple venues from the nonprofit space to work together. And then there's been other donors who have tried to convene and encourage nonprofits to work together. There's also, I think, through the United Way and through United Way innovators who are trying to figure out how they can create common platforms for HR, financial processing database that nonprofits would not have to repeat kind of generate for themselves. And I think I've seen these things, I think, are happening in patches in different parts of the country, and so I don't know how far away we are from them actually taking fire and creating that critical mass that we all of a sudden have some useful platforms where there's kind of a nonprofit in a box on a platform where you can just plug into, like you do, like a website, creating a website, just, or you create, like you create a small business on Amazon.com or something. So I haven't seen anything quite that simple, but I don't think we're too far away from that happening.
That would be tremendously useful to, I'm sure, a lot of people on this. I know having to figure out QuickBooks, and then you need a website, and then you need an outsourced person for this, and most of us don't have the kind of resources to hire folks for that. So that kind of leads me into the bigger question I always love to ask people, and I think some other ones are asking this. Can you envision a time where we ever going to get to a place where we don't need all this philanthropy? I mean, in our country, I mean, it's probably social policy issues, but if maybe people are giving less, the needs are still there. Is it just like this endless, our country is always going to have this huge sector of private philanthropy? Or do you think we're ever going to get to a place where we don't have to rely on the private sector to support all these issues?
There's two ways of answering that. One is the sense that, I think it's problematic that there's so much, there's this concentration of wealth, and there's been so many commentators from David Callahan to Anand Giridharadas to Edgar Villanueva talking about, and Rob Reich from Stanford talking about how, and Judge Brandeis used to talk about this too, I think, the notion that, concentrated wealth is, especially when it's passed across generations, and Thomas Jefferson talked about this as well, is kind of, not particularly conducive to a democracy where we all want to think of ourselves as equal in dignity in some way. So these huge fortunes, and then their ability to kind of sway the public sphere in one way or the other, I think are problematic. And I think we're having a very intense conversation. I don't think I've seen philanthropy discussed in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times this intensively since the last 5, 6, and now increasingly, with the Bernie Sanders and AOC notion that, a billionaire is a policy failure idea. So I think there's something there. But, philanthropy is also not to be equated with concentrated wealth. To our understanding of philanthropy as belonging to everybody, I would think it would be an impoverished civic space where kind of a centralized bureaucracy took care of everybody's needs so that they wouldn't really have to worry about what was happening with their neighbor. I think that would be a very different kind of society that I think would be, a little bit spooky. And I think we tried, maybe not very well, but we tried a little bit of these experiments with radical egalitarianism, of course, there was a rapacious party running the whole thing in the old communist days, including my former aspects of my former homeland. So I appreciate, that's there's two answers to that. One is the concentration of wealth, and it feeding into philanthropy or quasi big philanthropy. I think is problematic. But then there's also everyday philanthropy in the sense that you and I and everybody else increase our dignity by being able to give of ourselves. And we're not simply, contrary, some of my good economist friends, we're not simply acquisitive creatures that, by helping each other and giving to each other, And I think you see that in the social entrepreneurial spirit. People want to figure out how to solve social problems. They're not, it would be nice if they, made a living along the way, but they're trying to figure out problems and how to help each other. And so I think, yes, let's criticize big philanthropy that challenges the fact that we're all equal citizens in one vote, one person, one vote. But let's not forget that that's not the same thing as the helping behavior that is so important to who we are.
That is a beautiful way to sort of bring this whole full circle. So, Dean Pasic, I wanted to say thank you very much for joining us. I know we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but hopefully we answered most of them. And to the extent we can answer them offline, or perhaps Dean Pasic will, I might ask you for some further resources to share.
I'd be happy to share resources, and I'd be happy to share other experts who could help contribute to these important conversations that you and your colleagues are having, Rachel. And
excellent.
I want to say hi to. Just want to say hi to John Bader, my classmate, who I see in the chat there.
Oh, so. Good. Yeah, and we shared your name far and wide, so I hope people came out to see you here. So thank you again for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your thoughts. And it's nice to have a program where we can talk about Tocqueville and Jefferson and sort of academics at Chicago and things that just makes it a very rich conversation. And on top of the numbers we were able to look at. So we will look eagerly for your reports coming out of your school in June and some further resources, and we'll certainly share all these with everyone, and we will share this recording. We do it by video and audio, so you can share with your friends going forward. So Dean Pasic, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe out there with all your colleagues and family, and hopefully we'll get you back for another program in the future.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Take care. Good night, everyone.